So what type of company is Cybereason? Well, if you actually look into what they do, it doesn't have very much to do with election security. So it's odd for them to be running simulations about doomsday simulations, really about the 2020 election. So as I point out here, it seems a little odd, their interest in terror attacks on election day, which is what they simulated, not manipulations of vote counts or anything like that. They simulated terror attacks on election day for the US in 2020. So if you look at what Cybereason actually does, they sell cybersecurity solutions, essentially AI-driven, rather more sophisticated than antivirus software of the past, and also ransomware protection software. As I highlighted here, it uses a lot of artificial intelligence, cloud computing. The cloud they use is Amazon Web Services, which of course is pretty standard throughout the US national security, state, and other federal agencies. Straight from the horse's mouth, the former senior director for intelligence at Cybereason, he left relatively recently, says this about Cybereason's founders. Our founders are ex-Israeli intelligence who worked on the offensive side. They basically wanted to build a tool that would catch themselves. We follow the kill chain model started by Lockheed Martin, which, as we'll get into a moment, is one of Cybereason's main investors and a key part of the quote-unquote military industrial intelligence complex. Anyway, and try to interrupt every stage once an intruder's inside a target network. And here is Lior Div, Cybereason's CEO, saying that what they do on their platform is leverage artificial intelligence to be able to autonomously identify attackers, meaning that it doesn't really involve people so much, it's an automated process. So essentially, if you take that, give that an objective look, the only real innovative part of Cybereason is that they tweaked Lockheed Martin's existing model to be automated. And what they use as their main selling point, however, is how the company has deep ties to the military and military intelligence, and this sets them apart. They, in the past anyway, at least when I wrote this series, emphasized that to a great degree, slightly less now after my series first came out and got some attention.
I think it's a relevant question for people out there. We've talked in the past about Israel's government abusing the situation with the US, and even, like, let's say the one that most people are aware of, the fact that they stole nuclear technology from the US government, and that's why they have a nuclear program. That's something that's easy to look up. So in this case, when we're talking about the ex-Israeli intelligence running this to catch themselves or so on, it seems the question should be, is it not what happens if maybe Israel's government is the one doing it? I'm sure they won't be catching themselves in that case, or the US government.
Well, we'll be getting into a little more the background of the specific people that founded Cybereason and their ties to companies that have been rather scandalous for what they have done in terms of spying on the US federal government in the past. But for now, just want to go through this product, what they do as a company, because it really shows that their claimed justification for these election simulations, their official justifications for it, really don't hold any water. So anyway, moving along. They've already expanded and are prominent in the Internet of Things market and advanced healthcare systems. This, of course, is before the move to telehealth and all that stuff since the coronavirus crisis. So Cybereason conveniently positioned to benefit from that, as were a lot of intelligence-connected tech companies, not just Israeli intelligence, obviously US intelligence-connected tech companies like Google, among others, right? So anyway, Cybereason has a presence in the US, Europe, Israel, recently expanding into Asia and Latin America. They're very secretive about their financial performance. Moving on, they have a security research arm called Nocturnus that is run and largely staffed by people that are from Unit 8200, which is an Israeli military intelligence agency, often described as Israel's equivalent of the National Security Agency, or NSA. What Nocturnus does is that it functions basically like a private intelligence company, and they have been behind several claims that were cited without any sort of scrutiny by mainstream media in the US, attributing alleged hacks over the past 3 to 4 years or so to China and North Korea specifically, which of course have been used in recent months to say, look at China's history of hacking US systems in the lead up to the US election, where they say China and Iran, among other groups, are set to target US critical infrastructure. So that's worth keeping in mind. But as I note here, this security research arm of Cybereason Nocturnus, they do their research using Cybereason's global network of millions of endpoints for its intelligence gathering and research, right? Which basically, as I point out here, means the endpoints of every device to which Cybereason's software has access. And so this company is very much embedded in the US private sector, but also in you know, the other parts of the world I pointed out earlier, Europe, Israel, and beyond. But they're also very much embedded these days in the US private public sector, the government, which we can get to in a moment. So as I point out here, given what Cybereason provides as a company, their interest in offering election simulations to government officials free of charge seems a little odd, because there was no way for them to market their software based on what was simulated in the election, because in their election simulation, because it didn't, the simulation, as we'll show in a moment, did not involve any sort of attacks on election infrastructure at all. And what they did instead was use deep fakes, disinformation, and terror attacks, things like that. So moving on to the people behind Cybereason. Cybereason was created in 2012, and this year, the fact it was made this year is very significant. We'll get to that at the end of this article. But it was created in 2012 by 3 Israelis, all of whom were elite members of Unit 8200, which I pointed out here. Unit 8200 is an elite unit of the Israeli Intelligence Corps and is part of the IDF's Directorate of Military Intelligence, involved mainly in signal intelligence, surveillance, cyber warfare, and code decryption. It is well known for its surveillance of Palestinian citizens and using intercepted communications as blackmail in order to procure informants among Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank as a way of advancing the agenda of the Israeli national security state. So here's, well, I'll move on from that. But what's important in this paragraph here is that the NSA of the US and Unit 8200 have a long-standing collaborative relationship, best known for producing the Stuxnet virus, long considered to be the most damaging cyber attack in the history of the world. The target, of course, was Iran, who, allegedly is going to be hacking US infrastructure ahead of the 2020 election, just as Israel wants us to go to war with them. Weird. Anyway, so the current CEO and co-founder of Cybereason is Lior Div, according to a brief bio of his. When Div was in Unit 8200, he was a commander, and he carried out some of the world's largest cyber offensive campaigns against nations. Okay. So this is a guy that offensively and aggressively hacked other countries that were targets of Israel.
And I hope pointing out clear that that's illegal, right? That's not some, you're a good guy fighting for freedom and that's allowed. That's an illegal action no matter how you spin it.
Yeah, but not only that, but during the years where Div was there was an NSA document that was actually released as part of the Edward Snowden cache, where the NSA said that the third most aggressive nation state in hacking the United States was Israel after Russia and China, straight from the US government itself. So interesting to see that Div was involved in the world's largest cyber offensive campaigns against nations and cyber crime groups also. But I mean, this is a big deal that this is the guy that's in charge of Cybereason and simulating all this stuff about the election. And he received the Medal of Honor. Good for him. Okay.
Talk about wolf in the hen house, right? I mean, that's like the best analogy here. That's exactly what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other 2 co-founders of Cybereason that were also in Unit 8200, after they left Israeli intelligence officially, worked for something called Gita Technologies, which is a subsidiary of Verint, which used to be known as Converse Infosys. Okay, so Verint, or Converse, was initially funded by the Israeli government. It was founded by Kobi Alexander, a former Israeli intelligence officer who was wanted by the FBI on nearly 36 charges of fraud, theft, lying, bribery, money laundering, and other crimes for over a decade. And then he was finally extradited to the US and was only pled guilty to just a handful of the things that he was actually initially charged with. Anyway. Despite its history of corruption and foreign intelligence connections, Verint and Converse was actually hired by the NSA to create backdoors into all major US telecommunication systems and major tech companies, including Facebook, Microsoft, and Google.
People should ask themselves right there, what do you think a company or a government would do if that was what was happening to them? Do they then just hire that criminal and put them on the payroll and work with them? Or does that signify or indicate that there's more collaboration going on between these entities than adversarial, or maybe one group that has more control over the other, or so on? I mean, these are honest questions based on why a government would work with a group that just did that or is known to do that to the US government. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely crazy. I mean, things we can point to regarding the NSA and the Unit 8200 relationship, it's worth pointing out that former NSA Director Mike Rogers, now working for a company run by the former commander of Unit 8200 and funded by Google's Eric Schmidt. Team 8, Keith Alexander, another former NSA director, also gets a bunch of money from Team 8 via his private company, IronNet Cybersecurity. So, I mean, the NSA and the relationship with Israel's its Israeli equivalent is definitely concerning, but obviously complicated, and definitely, it's pretty clear here, not exactly acting in the best interest of U.S. national security at all, because a company like, that's deeply tied to Israeli intelligence, like Verint or Converse, to think that they want to keep these back doors for itself. Okay, the NSA will give you your back door, but to think they want to keep it for themselves when Israel has a documented history of selling backdoored software to the U.S. government. I mean, just look at the Promise software scandal, which, by the way, involved Robert Maxwell quite intimately. I mean, it's outrageous. Anyway, an article on Verint's access to U.S. tech infrastructure in Wired said the following about Verint, and this is where they essentially admit that companies like Verint, even though they're private companies, are greatly influenced by Unit 8200. So this retired general, a former commander of Unit 8200, noted his former organizations, meaning Unit 8200's, influence on Converse, which owns Verint, as well as other Israeli companies that dominate the U.S. eavesdropping and surveillance market. I mean, that's just outrageous. Anyway, as I note here, federal agents for years have reported systemic breaches at the Department of Justice, the FBI, the DEA, and the State Department, and even the White House, going all the way back to the 1990s. Breaches they claimed could all be traced back to just two companies, Converse Verint and Amdocs. Cybereason's other co-founder, the one that didn't work for a Verint subsidiary, was Lior Div, who instead worked for Amdocs. I mean, this is so outrageous. This company is insane, honestly.
It's macabrely comical to watch how stupidly obvious it is. But wasn't there also a tie-in with Israel using something in regard to the White House and beginning of Trump's administration that they just ignored?
Oh, yeah, there was a surveillance apparatus near the White House that was allegedly acquiring White House communications that I think someone in the federal government, maybe the FBI or DHS, I can't remember, off the record said that it was tied to Israel, and then Israel denied it. But it's worth pointing out that Amdocs in the late 1990s actually tapped the phones of the White House, and that is how Netanyahu got the tapes of Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky before anyone else, and attempted to use that as leverage over Bill Clinton for various means. Anyway, story for another day. Moving on. After leaving Amdocs, Lior Div founded a company called Alpha Tech. Alpha Tech on LinkedIn claims to specialize in headhunting and quality recruiting services, but it doesn't have a website. And Israeli media reports, in great contrast, say that Alpha Tech is a cybersecurity services company for Israeli government agencies. So they've never given any reason for the obvious disconnect in their public profile and what other people say they actually do. Div left that Israeli government contractor in 2012 to create Cybereason alongside these people working for Converse Infosys subsidiary that were also in Unit 8200 with him. This is probably the most outrageous quote ever, though. All right, so according to an interview that Div gave to TechCrunch in 2019, he stated in early 2019, he stated that his work at Cybereason is, quote, the continuation of the 6 years of training and service he spent working with the Israeli Army's Unit 8200. So he's literally saying his work at Cybereason is the continuation of his time at Unit 8200. If this doesn't scream front company to you, I don't know what does. And as we'll see in a little bit, In 2012 is the year that Israel's government made a deliberate policy to outsource intelligence operations that used to be done by intelligence agencies to private companies, specifically cybersecurity. And one of the companies created out of that new policy was Black Cube. They admit that. So Cybereason has all the markings of being just, another one of those. Anyway, I already mentioned this.
And for those who want to know more about Black Cube, as well as some other ones that I feel are tied in the same vein, we've talked about that a lot on the show. I think actually with Whitney in the past before, but it's very clear that these companies there's obvious track records. At the very least, whether you believe that's what this one is doing, there's ample evidence to be asking these questions. And yet when we do ask these obvious questions that make sense, we get attacked as anti-Semitic. Think about why that doesn't make sense.
Oh, man. Yeah. So anyway, going on to Cybereason's ties to intelligence. Yes, there's more. So not only do Cybereason's co-founders have all these ties to intelligence and say it's a continuation of their ties in intelligence or whatever, another part of Cybereason is very secretive, but they still have a presence on their website. They're called the Cybereason Intelligence Group, or CIG. They describe them as follows. The Cybereason Intelligence Group was formed with the unique mission of providing context to the most sophisticated threat actors. The group's members include experts in cybersecurity and international security from various government agencies, including Unit 8200. And their primary purpose, meaning this intelligence group's purpose, is to examine and explain the who and why behind cyber attacks, so that companies and individuals can better protect themselves. Okay, so basically what they're saying is that the Cybereason Intelligence Group that's operating as part of Cybereason contains active members of different government agencies, including active members of Unit 8200, who are anonymously assigning blame and motives to cyber attacks that take place on the global stage. Which is a convenient way to seed a narrative of who is hacking the US or who is hacking the UK without any sort of accountability. Because when you're able to do this as a private company and you assign blame saying this hack was China, this hack was Iran, you don't have the same sort of issues you run into if you're openly associated with Israel's government or openly associated with the US government and point the finger and go on the record and say it was this country, right? So you can literally have no evidence that it was any sort of state actor, but because you're an active member of a particular intelligence agency, you want to blame that country for that attack. You can do so by operating as a group just like this. So this is very alarming.
It also provides a little bit of a disconnect for people that aren't reading into it and looking into the information, where you've got one entity that's saying, this happened and here's who did it. And then you got seemingly a different entity saying, oh, well, here's why and here's the reasoning, right? So people see those as two separate things when really it's the same entity with the same ties. You got to think about the average person out there that's not researching these things and how they think, the simple ways that they manipulate their perception. It's an interesting point.
Right, good point. So here I point out that this Cybereason Intelligence Group, their reports focus exclusively on blaming Russia and China for hacks. And lo and behold, who are we being told is going to hack the 2020 election under the same sort of circumstances that Cybereason itself simulated for over 2 years? This is just really disconcerting. So when discussing nation-state cyber threats in general, Cybereason's website only mentions China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia by name, all of which are incidentally rival states of the US. Notably, Israel's government, as I mentioned earlier, named as a leading espionage threat to US financial institutions and federal agencies by the NSA itself, is absent from Cybereason's discussion of state actors. What do you know? Bam. All right. Then here I talk about how Nocturnus, another part of Cybereason, also has been assigning blames to nation states for specific hacks. Anyway, I go into Cybereason's advisory board here. There you have Robert Bigman, who was the former Chief Information Security Officer for decades for the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. While he was at the CIA, he oversaw the agency's commercial partner engagement program, meaning its alliances with Silicon Valley and the tech sector. And he's one of the main advisors to Cybereason. According to his biography, Robert Bigman, quote, contributed to almost every intelligence community information security policy and has provided numerous briefings to the National Security Council, Congress, and presidential commissions. And this guy is working for like what is an openly admitted by the CEO, right, of a front company for a foreign intelligence agency. And
That's
this
crazy.
is what he used to do. Outrageous.
And remember in that video we just watched too, they mentioned that one of the tech companies or one of these community entity groups that they're working with in regard to their joint terrorism task force. And it's interesting that there's another example of Cyber Reason having a tie to the tech companies, which then feed that information. That's
Right.
interesting.
Yes, isn't it? So Robert Bigman, despite being, this guy deeply tied to U.S. intelligence, is also an advisor to another Israeli tech company called Sepio Systems. The chairman of Sepio Systems is Tamar Pardo, who is a former head of Israel's Mossad. And Sepio is funded by the creators of the NSO Group, which you may know for its scandals related to the spying of rights activists, among other things, by Saudi Arabia and other countries. They've gotten in quite a bit of trouble for that in recent years, but nothing to see here, I guess, huh? So moving along, Cyber Reason's advisory board also includes Pinchas Bucharest, who is the former head of Unit 8200. He used to be, I think he may still be, on the board of APAC, by the way, and he was also former managing director of the IDF. He used to, at the time this article was written, he was on the board of directors of Carbine 911 alongside Ehud Barak and Nicole Junkerman, both well-known associates of intelligence-linked sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein himself funded Carbine to the tune of at least $1 million. We'll be talking more about Carbine 911 in a little bit because it's very relevant. But Bucharest, along with Barak and Junkerman, were all mysteriously dropped from Carbine 911's board because of the Epstein scandal. And wait till you see who they replaced them with. Wow, it's pretty nuts. Anyway, another notable Cyber Reason advisor is the former commissioner of the Boston Police Department, Edward Davis, who actually, after they removed Pinchas Bucharest from the board of Carbine 911, it's Edward Davis who was put in his place. So we have that link there between Cyber Reason and Carbine 911 anyway. Davis has heavily promoted Cyber Reason's disturbing election day simulations, and he even participated directly in one of them. And that very simulation, by the way, I'll show you guys in a second, is honestly the most eerie regarding the official narrative about what's about to transpire in the US 2020 election. But anyway, Davis is important because he was the top cop in Boston at the time of the Boston Marathon bombing, which, if you remember back to that, saw the imposition of near martial law like conditions throughout Boston during the manhunt for the alleged perpetrators of that bombing. Here I provide a link about the odd relationship between the alleged bombers and the FBI. If you want to read about that, you can go to my article and follow the link there, because it's
Recommend you do, guys.
Different rabbit hole.
Yeah, but that's an important one to understand, everybody out there.
Right. So this is particularly notable, this tie-in, because as we'll see in a moment, Cyber Reason's election day simulations ended with martial law being imposed on the fictional city used in the exercise. Anyway, Cyber Reason's other advisors include people at Google, at Lockheed Martin, and Motorola. Motorola and Lockheed both use Cyber Reason software on all of their company computers, and Lockheed Martin is a major investor in Cyber Reason, as I mentioned earlier.
You could also argue, I mean, obviously Lockheed Martin stands to benefit with any potential war type chaos, but also Motorola tied in. There seems to be a kind of profit motive there for them to be involved with these kind of things, with the tech aspect to it.
Right. So really quick, just to end this part about it being, Cyber Reason essentially being a front company. Here I link to this interview in Israeli media where Israel's government admits this policy in 2012 here about how cyber-related and intelligence projects that were previously carried out in-house in the Israeli military and Israel's main intelligence arms were transferred to companies that in some cases were built for that exact purpose. And if you go and read this article, which I highly recommend you do, it says that one of the companies built for this exact purpose is Black Cube, which, by the way, the head of Black Cube until his death was Meir Dagan, an ex-head of Mossad. who told 60 Minutes, the U.S. news program, that Israel wants the U.S. to go to war with Iran for it, so it can be a quote unquote international war, and it doesn't just have to be Israel's war. Something to keep in mind there. And here's another discussion of the blurred lines between Israel's intelligence apparatus and its private tech sector, which has actually even made it into Foreign Policy magazine in 2018. So these are some, just extra information on that if you'd like to read it. And a lot of the stuff we ended up already covering. Oh, well, this part's important. So as we mentioned earlier, Cybereason, their main product is antivirus and a network defense platform. A former NSA operator, talking about something else, of course, but he told the New York Times that antivirus programs, just like the one that Cybereason markets, is, quote, the ultimate backdoor, and that such a backdoor would provide consistent, reliable, and remote access that can be used for any purpose, from launching a destructive attack to conducting espionage on thousands or even millions of users.
Wow.
So something to keep in mind.
That's really huge. I mean, what she just laid out for you is the idea that that's what they're building, and they just straight up telling you that they have this back door, but let's pretend like that's not possible to be a backdoor into the United States. And that kind of manipulation that will lead into our conversations we'll be having today. That's just so incredible to me that this stuff is so clear. And just because people are afraid to be labeled anti-Semitic or afraid to, claim that an ally could be doing something like this,
right,
that's left right out in the open. It's incredible.
Well, what this intelligence agency, Israeli intelligence agency, is doing, though, is weaponizing Jewish identity as a way to protect its own operations, and that is actually feeding anti-Semitism. They don't actually care, it seems, about people of their own ethno-religious group and what sort of things may happen to them as a consequence of their actions. It's just very alarming.
Well put.
Anyway, this is going into Operation Blackout, which is the name of Cybereason's election simulation. It's worth pointing out that one of the things that Cybereason has simulated in relation to elections is the power grid being taken down, something that we've heard hinted may happen in 2020. And so it's interesting the name is Operation Blackout. Anyway, here I just start off talking about how last November of a year before the election that's about to take place, Cybereason hosted a 2020 election simulation with DHS, the FBI, who we were just talking about and what they're doing, right? And the US Secret Service. The simulation was organized by Cybereason, the law firm Venable, and US agencies appear not to have been charged to participate.
If the Secret Service is involved, I think that clearly implies that the Trump administration is involved, right? Like, for the people that might wonder whether or not there's involvement here with the current administration, I think it's clear that that is the case.
It's possible, but I don't want to speculate too much because a lot of the stuff here is already controversial enough. So anyway, so the simulation pitted quote unquote hacktivists or ethical hackers that were composed of Cybereason employees against a team of federal and local law enforcement officials. And there was like a referee or supervisor team called the White Team. That was Cybereason's chief security officer, Sam Curry. We'll get to him in a second because he's part of something called the National Security Institute that is full of PNAC neocons. And then the other guy was Ari Schwartz, who was a member, I believe, of the Obama administration's National Security Council advising the president, and also NIST. And he's also used to be part of the Center for Democracy and Technology, one of the main backers of Microsoft's Election Guard software. By the way, the part of DHS, it's called CISA, that's involved in guarding the election infrastructure ahead of the election, and also the power grid and all of that stuff, is a former top executive for Microsoft who has been promoting Election Guard this whole time. So, Election Guard is one of those things that if something bad happens to the election infrastructure, guess who's going to come riding to the rescue? Election Guard. Anyway, story.
And as always, ask whether or not that's the plan in order to give the justification to usher in what they want to drive in. That should be like the sentiment of the decade. Everything seems to be like that right now.
I should point out that Election Guard was not just developed by Microsoft, it was also Microsoft with a contractor whose only client is the Pentagon's DARPA. So worth pointing that out. Anyway, Operation Blackout did not involve hackers targeting election software or voting machines. Instead, it involved civilian infrastructure, attacks on civilian infrastructure, or cyber attacks rather, and then psychological operations against American citizens. The hacker team in this particular exercise was led by Cybereason co-founder and former contractor for Israeli government agencies and former operative in Unit 8200. This is what he had to say about the exercise. Quote, "In a country as fragmented as the US, the number of people needed to influence an election is surprisingly small. We attempted to create havoc and show law enforcement that protecting the electoral process is much more than the machine," end quote. Wow. So this team, by the way, this whole exercise, the way they officially justified it was because of the alleged Russian meddling in 2016, which was like, you know, memes on Facebook and stuff. So keep that in mind when you see the type of stuff that this guy unleashed on this fictional city. So Stream Amit's team completely devastated the US law enforcement team in Operation Blackout, not just by causing chaos, but murdering numerous civilians. Hackers took control of city buses, ramming them into civilians waiting in line to vote at polling stations, killing 32 and injuring over 200. Remember, this was on a city level. So if you extrapolate this to a national level, certainly a much higher death count. Anyway, they also took control of city traffic lights to cause traffic accidents. They used so-called deep fakes to conduct psychological operations on the populace and created fake bomb threats posing as the terror group ISIS. They hacked telecom networks and news outlets, flooded them with deep fakes aimed at spreading disinformation and panic among US citizens.
We should note on there too that Whitney and I were talking about the relevance to the Vault 7 stuff in regard to the you know, driverless cars being abused in this situation in regard to the polls with watchers and, you know, all the references there they made, even including deepfakes. These are all things that I'm going to go ahead and say, I personally, in my opinion, guarantee are going to happen because they've been telling us they're going to happen forever. But that's interesting.
Right. Well, I laid all that out in part 3 of the Cybereason series, which we'll be doing in the next video. So more on that in a little bit. Stay tuned. So anyway, in this particular exercise, as I said earlier, there was the supervising team, which was Sam Curry of Cybereason and Ari Schwartz. And they decided that the outcome of this face-off between the hacker and law enforcement teams was the cancellation of the US 2020 election, the declaration of martial law, the growth of public fear regarding terrorism, and allegations of US government collusion with a foreign actor. As I point out here, I sort of alluded to this earlier, given how the simulation played out, it is quite clear that it is a far cry from the actual scope of alleged foreign meddling during the 2016 election, allegedly the motive behind Operation Blackout. Indeed, the extent of Russian interference in the 2016 election amounted to $100,000 worth of Facebook ads over 3 years, 25% of which were never seen by the public, and claims that Russian state actors were responsible for leaking emails from Hillary Clinton and the DNC. Of course, you know,
which is fundamentally not true, and that's been incredibly shown.
But this is the justification for this exercise, which, if you paid attention to what I just said, appears more like a terror attack targeting elections than a covert means of manipulating their outcomes, right? So it's worth pointing out that this Operation Blackout, the one that occurred last November, is hardly the only simulation Cybereason has conducted. In the weeks after that simulation last November, they repeated the same exercise in London, this time with UK intelligence